The hearing room was already tense, but when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, the tension transformed into electricity. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't grandstand. She just asked one question, simple, legal, direct. "Congressman Jordan," she said, "can you define what due process means in a criminal proceeding?" A pause. The kind of pause that stretches and chokes. Cameras caught the flicker in Jim Jordan's eyes, the searching glance toward aides, the slight clench of his jaw. For a man who barked accusations like a courtroom drill sergeant, the silence was deafening. "I mean, well, he stammered. "One question, one answer, one collapse." Crockett didn't move. She waited, eyes locked. The rhythm of the room shifted, no longer under his control. For once, Jim Jordan wasn't the one pressing. He was cornered, live on national television, with nowhere to go but back into the legal shadows he so often manipulated. The silence grew teeth. The murmurs began. Reporters' pens halted mid-sentence. Aides whispered behind folders. A single glance across the panel said it all. Did he really not know? Crockett finally broke the silence, but only just. "That's all right," she said, barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect you to." It was both scalpel and sledgehammer, not a roar, a revelation. This wasn't just a rhetorical win. It was a televised exposure. A congressman who routinely demanded accountability couldn't define the foundation of it. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. TikTok cuts, viral memes, hashtags like Crockett vs. Chaos and Legal 101 for Jim. Even late-night hosts couldn't resist. When your whole brand is order, but you can't explain what it means when someone's arrested. And yet, beneath the laughter, something deeper stirred. For every viewer who had ever been talked over, dismissed, or belittled, especially black women, immigrants, and anyone told they were too emotional for the facts. This moment wasn't just satisfying. It was personal. Jasmine Crockett didn't just question Jim Jordan. She questioned the system that made his bluster seem credible. But what led to this moment was months in the making, and it begins with a man who's dodged accountability for decades. The story didn't start with a question. It started with a hearing, another one in a long string of political spectacles dressed up as oversight. The Judiciary Committee convened under fluorescent lights and heavy sighs, tasked with investigating what Jim Jordan had branded as the weaponization of government, a phrase thrown around so often it had lost all shape, all meaning until Jasmine Crockett walked into the room. The stakes were high, though wrapped in procedural language. Accusations that federal agencies were targeting conservatives, that whistleblowers were silenced, that justice itself had become partisan. But beneath the fog, one thing was clear. This was less about law and more about theater. And Jim Jordan, as always, was ready to play his lead role. He entered the hearing not with facts, but with volume, rattling off grievances like bullet points on a cable news ticker, waving folders that may or may not have held anything relevant, interrupting witnesses, talking over his colleagues. His playbook was familiar. Overwhelm, confuse, dominate. But across the table, Jasmine Crockett was preparing a different strategy. Quiet, intentional, legal. The night before, she'd stayed late. Highlighter in one hand, binder tabs in the other. She'd seen this before: powerful men who assumed that if they shouted long enough, no one would ask them anything real. But she wasn't there to shout. She was there to pin truth against the wall and watch what squirmed. This wasn't her first hearing, and it wouldn't be her last. But today felt different. Maybe it was the buildup of months of misinformation. Maybe it was the exhaustion of seeing Jordan dodge, deflect, and distort. Or maybe it was just time. She watched him grandstand, repeating the same inflammatory lines he'd used in interview after interview. The deep state. Two-tier justice. They're coming. After you. And yet, when pressed, truly pressed, he rarely answered. He performed. But today, someone actually fought back. When the gavel slammed and her time came, Crockett didn't lean into drama. She leaned into law, into clarity, into something that couldn't be spun into a soundbite. And across the country, viewers tuned in expecting another partisan shouting match. But what they got was something else. Something they didn't know they needed. A calm dismantling of political fiction. A viral masterclass in how you hold power accountable, not with volume but with knowledge. Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to play games. She was there to change the rules. To understand why Jim Jordan crumbled so easily, we have to understand who he really is. For years, Jim Jordan crafted a persona out of confrontation. He wasn't the legislator in the room quietly writing law. He was the storm at the center of the hearing. Rolled-up sleeves, rapid-fire accusations, voice always a few decibels too high. He didn't just question witnesses, he bulldozed them. To his supporters, he was a warrior. To others, a disruptor. But to everyone watching, one thing was certain. Jim Jordan knew how to seize control of a room. "I'm just asking questions," he'd say, again and again. But they weren't questions in search of truth. They were traps, performances, often detached from legal grounding and designed only to score points on Fox News by nightfall. He didn't wait for answers. He didn't want them. He wanted submission. If the witness pushed back, he raised his voice. If they tried to clarify, he cut them off. In those rooms, Jordan set the tempo, and that tempo was chaos. One of his favorite tactics? Shifting the goalpost mid-sentence. Ask a question, interrupt the answer, then declare the response insufficient. "That's not what we're discussing. Right now," he'd snap, even if he had just brought it up seconds earlier. It was the kind of sleight of hand that turned hearings into theater and truth into noise. And yet beneath the volume, there was a vacuum. Jordan, despite his law and order branding, has no legal background. He never practiced law. Never stepped into a courtroom to argue a case. And it showed at least to those who knew what to look for. While he postured as a defender of justice, he repeatedly shielded allies from accountability, dismissed subpoenas when they targeted his party, and deflected questions that pressed too close to home. One of the most glaring contradictions, his silence on the sexual abuse scandal at Ohio State, where multiple former wrestlers alleged misconduct under a team doctor's care during Jordan's time as assistant coach. When asked, Jordan defaulted to denial. He called the allegations false, even as the number of accusers grew. And when pressed further, he pivoted. "We're not here to talk about that," he'd say, leaning into deflection as armor. The pattern became undeniable. Challenge everyone, answer to no one. His rise within the GOP wasn't about results. It was about performance. His hearings were less about oversight and more about outrage. As chair of the House Judiciary Committee, he wielded the gavel like a megaphone, amplifying claims of conspiracy, weaponization, deep state shadows. But when the gavel turned against him, when someone questioned him, he rarely held up. Because Jim Jordan never expected to be questioned by someone who understood the law better than he did. He thrived in chaos because chaos masked his weaknesses. He could rant about the FBI, rail against the DOJ, and still never answer a basic legal question about due process or burden of proof. His power wasn't rooted in knowledge, it was rooted in noise, and for a long time that was enough. He stood, untouchable, not because he was brilliant, but because no one dared to confront him on his terms, or if they tried, they were quickly drowned out. But something shifted. The rules changed not in the chamber, but in the culture. People started looking for more than volume. They wanted clarity, substance, facts. And into that moment stepped someone who didn't play to the crowd but to the record, because on the other side of the table sat a woman who didn't just come prepared. She came to dismantle an entire playbook, before the cameras, before the headlines, Before she ever sat behind a congressional microphone, Jasmine Crockett was the kind of woman the system underestimated until it couldn't. Born and raised in Texas, Crockett didn't come from dynasties or deep-pocket donors. She came from grit, from classrooms where she had to raise her hand higher to be seen, from courtrooms where she had to be twice as sharp just to be heard, from a state that often told young black girls like her to sit down, and where she learned, early, how to stand taller instead. She didn't seek power. She sought purpose. Law school wasn't a step toward prestige. It was a fight for armor. She chose criminal defense not because it was easy, but because it was urgent. While her peers chased corporate firms and corner offices, Crockett walked into jails, public defender offices, and courtrooms filled with names no one bothered to pronounce correctly. She met clients who didn't trust the system because the system had never worked for them. And she listened, not just to their cases, to their stories, to their fear. That's what shaped her. That's what sharpened her. When she spoke in court, it wasn't to impress judges, it was to protect people. She understood the law not as a weapon, but as a shield. She memorized precedent, internalized process, and carried herself with the quiet force of someone who didn't need to yell to be powerful. She doesn't raise her voice, one former client once said. She raises the facts. That reputation followed her, from the courtroom to activism, from protests to press briefings, and eventually to politics, not because she chased a seat, but because people begged her to take one. Her campaign wasn't flashy. It was fearless. She ran on truth, on policy, on representation. She talked about health care, housing, voter suppression, and the legal system from inside the fight. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep. She didn't posture. She just showed up with receipts. And when she won her seat in Congress, it wasn't seen as a miracle. It was seen as a message. She brought that same energy to Washington. While others rehearsed sound bites, she read legislation. While some chased photo ops, she chased inconsistencies in bills, footnotes in oversight reports, and missing answers from men who had never been challenged by someone like her. She didn't become a symbol. She became a standard, and still the opposition underestimated her. To them, she was new, unseasoned. One of those progressives. She smiled at the label, knowing full well that every time they thought she was too soft, too young, too bold, she was already 2 steps ahead. Binder open. Facts loaded, because Jasmine Crockett didn't show up to Congress to become famous. She showed up because she'd spent years watching people suffer, while men like Jim Jordan turned pain into politics. She'd seen injustice paraded as ideology. She'd watched hearings devolve into theater. And she'd waited patiently for a moment when the noise would pause just long enough for clarity to break through. This was that moment. When she entered the chamber that day, she wasn't bracing for battle. She was preparing for truth. And unlike her opponent, she didn't need to bluff. She knew the law. She lived it. She'd defended it. She'd upheld it in rooms where no cameras rolled, where no one handed her talking points, where no one told her she was a hero. Just rooms, where people were scared, and she became their voice. So when the mic turned on, when Jim Jordan launched into his usual barrage, when the room swelled with the familiar weight of his bravado, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She let him play his game. Then, with a calm precision only years of real legal practice can teach, she asked a single question, the kind of question you don't ask unless you already know the answer. The kind that reveals everything. And on this day, facing off against one of the loudest voices in Congress, she didn't flinch. The hearing resumed under the same fluorescent hum. Jim Jordan, perched at the helm, leaned into his mic with that now familiar smirk, eyes scanning the room like a prosecutor auditioning for prime time. His voice, sharp and performative, cut through the static. "Let me ask you this, do you believe the Department of Justice is being weaponized against conservatives?" he demanded, gesturing vaguely toward a stack of cherry-picked reports. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She watched, listened. Jordan rattled off half-formed accusations about bias, whistleblowers, redacted files, the so-called two-tiered system. He layered speculation with anecdote, volume with certainty. The strategy was obvious. Keep it fast, keep it loud, don't give anyone time to check the footing. But Crockett didn't chase him. She waited. When her time came, she clicked her pen once, set her notes down slowly, and leaned forward, not toward the cameras, but toward the truth. "Congressman Jordan," she began, "do you know what prosecutorial discretion means under federal law?" Jordan blinked. "Well, I mean, that's not what we're here to discuss." "I'm just clarifying," she said, her tone even. "Because you've repeatedly claimed the DOJ is playing favorites. That would require us to examine the standards by which prosecutorial discretion is applied, right?" The room shifted. The air thickened. "I'm asking the questions here," Jordan shot back, reaching for control. Crockett didn't react. She didn't need to. The moment was already slipping out of his hands. She asked again. This time slower. "Congressman, are you familiar with Brady v. Maryland?" Jordan's mouth opened, closed. He muttered something about political persecution. She waited, and waited, and watched the clock tick as Jordan squirmed. He tried to pivot. "The American people want answers," he insisted, volume rising. "They want to know why conservatives are being treated differently." Crockett nodded once, then delivered a line like a gavel to the table. "And they deserve someone who understands the law before accusing others of breaking it." Silence. For the first time in the hearing, Jim Jordan didn't have a comeback. The cameras captured everything. The tension, the reversal, the way Crockett never raised her voice, but somehow made the room go silent. Jordan tried again, fumbled through a half-thought rebuttal about equal treatment, but the energy had shifted. He wasn't leading. He was cornered. Crockett continued, slow and surgical. "Because without a working definition of due process, of prosecutorial discretion, of equal protection under the law, what exactly are we debating today, Congressman?" "No." "Answer?" She looked at the chair, then back at Jordan. "Exactly." But then with just one sentence, she flipped the room upside down. Jasmine Crockett tilted her head slightly, the kind of movement that's less about posture and more about precision. Her eyes never left Jim Jordan, who had just stumbled through, yet another attempt to recenter the conversation around partisan victimhood. His words piled up like a tower of cards, aggressive, loud, and one breeze away from collapse. She leaned in, voice calm. "Congressman, let me help you out here." A few chuckles flickered around the room, but Crockett wasn't joking. Her tone didn't change, her expression didn't soften. She flipped a page in her binder, neat, annotated, color-coded. She knew exactly where this was going. "Earlier, you suggested that the Department of Justice has targeted certain individuals unfairly," she began, her cadence measured, deliberate. "You made claims about selective prosecution, about violations of civil rights, about political bias." Jordan shifted in his seat. "So before we go any further," she continued, "can you explain what selective prosecution actually means? In legal terms?" The pause returned longer this time, heavier. Jordan opened his mouth, but what came out wasn't an answer. "Well, look, we know what it looks like when there's a double standard. I'm asking for the definition." "Congressman?" He blinked, stammered. "It's when they go after, people on one side of the aisle more than..." She cut in, not with sharpness, but with surgical clarity. "Selective prosecution requires evidence that the decision to prosecute was based on an unjustifiable standard, such as race, religion, or exercise of constitutional rights. Are you alleging that any of the cases you mentioned meet that threshold?" Jordan fumbled with a paper in front of him. No answer. "Because if you are," she continued, I'd like to know what specific evidence you're referring to beyond headlines. Another pause. Congresswoman, we're not here for a law school lecture, he snapped, tone growing defensive. No, we're here for accountability, she responded. And accountability requires understanding what you're talking about. The room held its breath. Aides froze mid-type. Committee members looked up. One staffer near the back muttered, "Oh, she's cooking him." And she was. Crockett continued. Congressman, let's go simpler. Can you define due process? Jordan's voice faltered. Of course I can. It's when people get a fair shot, a fair trial. And what clause of the Constitution guarantees it? He went silent. She raised an eyebrow. Fifth Amendment, 14th Amendment, basic civics. And yet you've accused the department of violating it multiple times on the record without once clarifying what it actually entails. Jordan looked down. He didn't respond. She nodded once. That's all right. I didn't expect you to. Gasps. Audible ones. A ripple moved through the chamber. Even the stenographer paused, and it wasn't just the room. Twitter exploded. Crockett clapped back, began trending within minutes. Clips hit TikTok before the hearing even adjourned. Users stitched. The moment with commentary. She ate without seasoning. Jordan walked into a courtroom and got bodied by the lawyer in heels. This wasn't a hearing. This was a masterclass. Late-night shows pulled it for cold opens. Headlines rolled in. Crockett exposes legal holes in Jordan's grandstanding. Subreddits lit up. Memes were born. One had Jordan's face, superimposed over a chalkboard with "due process" written beside a giant shrug emoji. Another showed Crockett as neo-dodging Jordan's legal misfires in slow motion. But the moment wasn't just viral, it was symbolic. For years, Jordan dominated hearings with volume and bravado. He played the aggressor, the bulldog, the man who never let a question finish. He created chaos to control the narrative. And then Jasmine Crockett walked in calm, composed, fluent in the law, and dismantled it all with a single question. It wasn't personal. It was surgical. She didn't insult. She didn't yell. She simply exposed. If you don't understand basic criminal procedure, she said, how? Are you chairing this hearing? Jordan had no answer. Because this wasn't about partisanship. This was about preparedness, about the difference between someone who performs oversight and someone who understands the systems they're overseeing. Crockett had done what few had dared to try, and what fewer still could pull off. She didn't just survive Jordan's tactics, she turned them back on him. Every deflection became a void. Every half-truth fell flat against her full facts. Every interruption only highlighted his desperation. And America saw it. Viewers who had long watched hearings with frustration, who were tired of watching smart, qualified women be talked over, finally saw a reversal. She didn't just stop the noise. She replaced it with clarity. And the effect was seismic. Jim Jordan didn't walk out defeated. He walked out exposed, not by slander, not by shouting, but by the quiet, brutal weight of someone who came armed with knowledge and wasn't afraid to use it. But it wasn't just a mic drop. It was a political earthquake. The clip didn't just go viral, it detonated. Within an hour of the hearing's end, the internet was ablaze. On TikTok, the moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her clean, devastating line, "If you don't understand basic criminal procedure, how are you chairing this hearing?" was replayed, remixed, and elevated into instant folklore. Creators added sound effects, slow zooms, beat drops. One added the Mortal Kombat finish hymn voiceover. Another cut to a shot of Jim Jordan pixelating into dust, Thanos style. The caption, "Legal snap." On Twitter, or X, as it was now technically called, the hashtag Crockett Clapback surged to the top of trending. Within 12 hours, it was joined by "Yeah, she brought receipts." Jim Jordan folded, and the instant classic, order in the Crockett court. Late-night comedy shows didn't wait for writers' meetings. The moment became the cold open on multiple networks. Stephen Colbert played the clip in full and stared deadpan into the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what a bar-certified beatdown looks like. On The Daily Show, a guest legal analyst broke it down like a football replay, drawing circles around Jordan's blinking eyes and Crockett's poised posture. But it wasn't just comedians. Legal scholars and journalists weighed in. MSNBC ran a segment titled, "The Power of Knowing the Law in a Room Full of Pretenders." CNN had a chyron that read, "Crockett, to Jordan, know the law or leave the hearing." Harvard law professors posted side-by-side breakdowns of Crockett's definitions and Jordan's deflections. One tweet read, "This wasn't a debate. This was a deposition," and Crockett held the pen. Celebrities joined the chorus. Kerry Washington retweeted the clip with, "This is how you carry both poise and power." Mark Ruffalo posted, "She came with facts and left with the internet." Even Beyoncé fans hijacked the timeline, dubbing her Crockett the Destroyer, and pairing the moment with a Destiny's Child soundtrack. But it wasn't just elite validation. The real power came from everyday people. Mothers tweeted about showing the clip to their daughters. Law students wrote how the exchange made them feel seen. Black women in particular flooded timelines with pride and recognition. This is what it looks like when they try to talk over you and you stay rooted in truth. A viral comment on Reddit read, "For once, the smartest person in the room was also the most silent until it mattered." Crockett's social media exploded. Instagram followers doubled overnight. Her team had to mute her Twitter mentions to keep up. Her office inbox flooded with thank you emails from teachers, defenders, paralegals, and people who had been ignored in rooms just like that. Meanwhile, Jim Jordan stuck to the script. He went on conservative radio calling the hearing a distraction, accusing Democrats of lawfare, and vaguely suggesting he was ambushed. But the damage was already done. He wasn't trending. He was deflecting. Even right-wing hosts struggled to defend the moment. One Fox News panel tried spinning it. She was disrespectful, too aggressive. But the footage spoke louder than spin. Jordan had no answers, and America had already moved on, or rather, moved towards something stronger. Because this wasn't just entertainment, it was catharsis. People who had been talked over their entire lives finally saw someone talk back and win. Not with shouting, not with spectacle, with substance, with preparation, with discipline, with the kind of calm you can't fake. Crockett didn't just shut down a man who had steamrolled over others for years. She reminded people what it feels like to see intellect wielded as a weapon not to harm, but to hold accountable. And for every young person of color watching, for every woman told she was too much, for every immigrant child taught to stay quiet, it was more than a moment. It was a mirror. But Jasmine Crockett didn't just school Jim Jordan. She reminded America of something deeper. It would be easy to call it just another viral moment, another clip in a never-ending loop of political content. But this wasn't about virality. It was about visibility. And the contrast on display couldn't have been sharper. On one side sat arrogance wrapped in confidence, inflated by years of unchecked noise. Jim Jordan, the perennial interrupter, the man who mistook volume for vision, swaggered into that hearing expecting deference. He expected dominance, because that's what the system had always given him. And on the other side sat dignity. Not the kind that announces itself, the kind that waits, observes, and then, when the noise has exhausted itself, speaks. Jasmine Crockett didn't win the moment because she was louder. She won because she was prepared, because she respected the process enough to know it deeply, because she didn't show up to perform for the cameras, she showed up to protect the truth. That is what public service is supposed to look like. not sound bites, not conspiracy, not deflection, but clarity. We live in an era where bluster is often rewarded, where shouting wins airtime and facts get flattened under the weight of spin, where the loudest person in the room can rewrite the narrative simply because they never pause long enough to be questioned. But Crockett changed the rhythm. She slowed it down. She asked the kinds of questions that can't be shouted over. And in doing so, she didn't just expose one man's ignorance. She exposed a culture of entitlement that assumes power doesn't need preparation. She reminded America that knowing what you're talking about still matters. That law isn't a weapon to be flung around in service of ideology. That words like due process and equal protection aren't just phrases to toss into press releases, they are promises. Constitutional ones, ones that must be understood to be defended. She reminded us that intellect is not elitism, that grace under fire is not weakness, that the people we send to Congress shouldn't just fight, they should know what they're fighting for. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a representative. She was a reckoning, a modern-day David in a chamber full of Goliaths, not with a sling, but with a statute book, and for every viewer who's felt overlooked, underestimated, silenced. Her voice carried something more than confidence. It carried hope. Hope that truth can still cut through noise. Hope that facts can still win the floor. Hope that dignity, though quiet, can still roar when the moment calls. Dignity isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. Dignity simply waits, and then speaks. And when it does, even the arrogant fall silent. "Congressman, let me help you out here." That line echoed far beyond the walls of Congress. It rang through phones, filled timelines, sparked conversations in classrooms, courtrooms, and kitchens. Because in that one moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just call out ignorance. She called up every person who's ever been talked down to, shouted over, or dismissed for daring to know their stuff. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to match chaos with chaos. She simply spoke the truth and let the silence do the rest. This wasn't just a takedown, it was a turning point. A reminder that preparation beats posturing. That the law belongs to all of us, not just those loud enough to twist it. And that somewhere in this noisy democracy, calm brilliance still matters. So if you felt that shift, if you saw yourself in Crockett's poise, if you heard something powerful in the quiet between her questions, then let it echo. Hit that like button. Share the clip. Drop a comment and tell us what you would have said in that chair. Because this isn't just about one moment. It's about building a future where truth stands taller than bluster. If you believe calm brilliance beats chaos, hit that like button, share the clip, and let them know we see the truth. And we're not backing down. This is what democracy looks like. And we're just getting started.